I want to thank you all for your flexibility. I know there have been changes in the venue because of the federal shutdown, and so we got a bigger venue, and we are delighted that you've come out this evening, but thank you for your flexibility. And I also want to thank Chance Cooley. Chance Cooley is a junior here at the University of Texas, and it's because of Chance that Andrew Roberts, our featured speaker here tonight, is here. So if you would just acknowledge Chance Cooley. A budding lawyer who is apparently very tenacious. So I have high hopes for your future, Chance. Thank you so much for putting this together tonight. We are delighted to welcome Andrew Roberts, renowned author of The Storm of War, A New History of the Second World War, Masters and Commanders, How Four Titans Won the War in the West, and Napoleon, A Life. His work has won various awards, including the LA Times Book Prize for Biography, the Wolfson History Prize, and the British Army Military Book Award. Tonight, Mr. Roberts will talk about his latest triumph, Churchill, Walking with Destiny, which, by the way, will be sold on premises after the program and signed by Andrew Roberts. His book has been on the New York Times bestseller list for a whopping 8 weeks. It has also received the kind of commercial and critical success that authors dream of, including a review in the Wall Street Journal, which reads in part, "We now have 2 reasons to be grateful to Mr. Roberts. The first is that his is inarguably the best single biography of Winston Churchill. The second is that as a result, no reasonable person will write a Churchill biography for years to come." So you're putting many good authors out of work, Andrew, with this superlative book of yours. The review goes on. The book is a brilliant feat of storytelling, monumental in scope, yet put together with tenderness for a man who always believed that he would be Britain's savior. Andrew will be interviewed tonight by our friend Karl Rove, who was senior advisor to George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007 and deputy chief of staff from 2004 to 2007. Karl is himself a best-selling author of 2 books, his memoir, Courage and Consequence, and his book on the 25th president titled The Triumph of William McKinley. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Andrew Roberts and Karl Rove.
Thank you, Mark. So Updegrove says you got to interview Roberts. And I said, why don't we just let the man talk? And he says, no, we need you to play the role of Charlie Rose. I said, my wife won't let me. He says, well, you can be Edward R. Murrow. I said, I don't smoke. He said, okay, fine, you're a conservative, William F. Buckley. I said, I can't pronounce all those big words. So we're going to have some fun. Andrew, incidentally, has been in Texas since Friday. And over the weekend, we treated him to a ranch dinner featuring shank of wild boar. So he's beginning to think he has a grasp on what it is to be Texan. So be thinking about your questions so you can leave a memorable impression upon him when we get to the audience participation. I want to start by playing off of what Mark said. 1,009 biographies. Why the hell do we need another?
First of all, may I say what a great honor it is to be here at the LBJ Presidential Library. And the answer is really that in the last decade, there have been no fewer than 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College, Cambridge, in the Churchill Archives, including the papers of his daughter, Mary Soames. Her Majesty the Queen has allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries, the diaries of King George VI. And Churchill met the king every Tuesday of the Second World War. They had lunch together, and Churchill trusted the king with all of the great secrets of the Second World War, the nuclear secrets, the ultra secrets, who he was going to hire and fire, the countries that they were going to attack, and so on. And so that was a fantastic news source. There's also been the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador in the early part of the war, which have just become available in the last 3-4 years. The verbatim accounts of the cabinet, the war cabinet, which I discovered in 6 years ago, and the love letters of Pamela Harriman, which she led a very active romantic life in the Second World War, and lots of the people that she slept with knew Churchill well. So the fact is that there is a huge cornucopia of new information, which means that in pretty much every page of my book, there's something that will not have appeared in any Churchill biography before.
You start, obviously, at the beginning, the birth of Churchill. I'm taken by the longing that you describe that he has as a child for parental affection, and yet it's affection that he rarely receives. Tell us about his relationship with his parents and how you see that effect on the, sort of his character and his life.
Yes, it's a very sad story, really, because both his parents were. His father was a brilliant, mercurial, highly intelligent, successful man, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who never at any point saw anything particularly special about his son. In fact, some of the most moving letters in this book are a desperate need for affection from Winston Churchill and getting nothing but, frankly, contempt from his father. And his mother seemed to be the absolute opposite of what one expects from American motherhood. She took no notice of him either. And she was a beautiful socialite who led a very active social life, but in the whole of the first 6 months of 1884, for example, when Winston Churchill was 9 years old, she only saw him for 6.5 hours. And so this poor lad, who also went to a prep school where he was sadistically beaten by his headmaster, really went, in order to get love and affection, he went for his nanny's love and affection, Mrs. Everest, who treated him well and in fact was the person who spotted the lacerations on his bottom that came as a result of this sadist at his prep school. And so psychologically, he had every right to be very dysfunctional. But actually, he showed so much love and affection for his parents. After his father's death, he wrote his father's biography, 2 volumes, over 1,000 pages. He sought out his father's friends. He called his own son Randolph after his father. And in his autobiography, My Early Life, he said of his mother that she shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance.
In addition to sort of reacting as we would not expect to that kind of relationship with his parents, he is strangely imbued right from the early age with a sense that he is made for great things. You tell the story, he's 16 and he tells his schoolhood chum that he's going to save England from invasion and London from extermination.
That's right, yes. He was 16 years old. His friend Merlin Evans, he was discussing their futures together, and Churchill, rather extraordinarily for a 16-year-old, says, I can see in the future, I can see great struggles, terrible upheavals, and I shall be called upon to save London and save England from invasion. And, of course, everybody would have been permitted to have laughed at him when he was 16. Half a century later, exactly that happened. He had this extraordinary sense of destiny, one that was in many ways imparted to him by the many close brushes with death that he had in his life.
So how did this sense of destiny reveal itself as an adult? What does it allow him to do, and what's the arc of his life that is affected by this? In times of stress and strain and turmoil, how does he react?
Well, what it did was to allow him to be incredibly calm under pressure. Because he believed that he was destined to save London and save England, when the terrible, most perilous days that ever threatened my country dawned in 1940 and 41, they found the Prime Minister completely calm, in fact making jokes. And the more dangerous the situation got, the funnier his jokes became. And so this had a truly positive effect on him. But when there were so many occasions when he nearly died. There was one when he was in the trenches of the First World War, and he left his dugout, and 5 minutes later, a German whiz-bang high explosive hit the dugout, direct hit, and decapitated everybody inside. And of that occasion, he said that he felt that he had invisible wings that were beating over him. And of course, these invisible wings were the providence that was going to save him and therefore allow him in a future war to save London and England.
Young man, loves his father. Father is a politician. He wants to follow his father into politics and have a political career. Talk about the extraordinary rise of the young Winston Churchill. I mean, this is astonishingly fast.
Yes, he's very much driven by an attempt to want to vindicate his father and his father's memory. His father had resigned in 1806 and had been frozen out by the conservative establishment, and he wanted to get into politics, but he had no money, largely because his parents were huge spendthrifts. And so he became a war correspondent, became the best paid war correspondent in the world, in fact, at one point. Between the ages of 21 and 25, he fought in no fewer than 4 campaigns on 3 continents. And in the course of that, he managed to make such a name for himself for his bravery. He escaped from a prisoner of war camp and crossed 300 miles of enemy territory, hiding in down in a mine at one point, where when the candle guttered out, he had rats crawling across his face, and followed by a vulture as well at one point. And so when he got back to Britain, he was a national hero, and he was able, therefore, to fight a parliamentary seat which other people of his age and class and background were able just to buy. He had to have made a name for himself in order to be able to have a chance to get into politics.
So he's elected to the parliament at the age of
25.
So, yeah. The constitutional age at which you can enter the U.S. House of Representatives, very few people do.
Yeah.
So, fast forward, this is 1901?
1899, 1900.
Yeah. So, 14 years later, World War I. And the young man is now the First Lord of the Admiralty, in command of the greatest navy on the face of the planet. And during this time, he pushes for the invasion of the Dardanelles, of Turkey, in essence, send the fleet up the Dardanelles, open a land route or water route to Russia, and force the Ottoman Empire out. And it goes horribly wrong.
That's right. On the 18th of March 1915, this brilliant plan to try, as you say, to get the Royal Navy through the Dardanelles Straits, anchor it off Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and thereby knock the Turks out of the Central Powers, which would, if it had come off, been one of the great coups of the Great War, goes horribly wrong, with 6 ships being sunk in the attempt to get through the Dardanelles. And then, instead of calling the whole thing off, Churchill very much is the key figure behind increasing the whole attempt and landing a large army on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is on the European side of the Straits. And they get bogged down from the 25th of April 1915 onwards into a terrible slogging match, just as bad as anything that was seen on the Western Front. And in the course of that, no fewer than 147,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded. And this, of course, was very much held against Churchill. He wasn't the only person who wanted this, but he was the most prominent one. And so he really, up until the 1930s, there were still people shouting, "What about the Dardanelles?" at him in in public meetings.
Yeah. How does he personally react to this? He's obviously forced out.
He's forced out of government, he resigns, and he decided to go and fight in the trenches. He didn't need to. He wasn't of age where we were calling up married men of 40 plus at that stage. And yet he, in a sort of redemptive sense, felt that he had to share the dangers of the men that he'd sent to the Dardanelles. So he became a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Scots Fusiliers in charge of the 6th Battalion, and he was tremendously brave then. I mean, all through his life, physical courage is an absolute part and parcel of Winston Churchill, and he went into no man's land no fewer than 30 times in the course of the 6 months that he commanded the battalion, which he didn't need to do because he could have stayed back at battalion headquarters. But he got so close to the German trenches on occasion he could actually hear them speaking in them.
Does this have any role to play in his recovery? Because by 1925, he's not only back in politics, but having left the Conservative Party as a young parliamentarian, he's gone back to the Conservative Party from the Liberal Party and seems to be the coming young man.
Yes, that's right. He said of changing his party twice that anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. And he, by the end of the First World War, he had been Minister of Munitions, which is a very important role, with 2.5 million people working in the munitions factories worked under him. And this was part of something that he was to say later in his life when he became Prime Minister in 1940. He wrote in his memoirs, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." And being Minister of Munitions was an obvious, and indeed First Lord of the Admiralty, was an obvious preparation for the hour and the trial of 1940.
So shortly thereafter, though, shortly after he returns to the Conservative Party, he's thrust out of government, and on come by the end of the 20s, the wilderness years. He is out of parliament and party. He has suffered terrible financial reverses in the Depression. He almost dies in a pedestrian accident in New York.
Actually, yes, on the front of this book, you can see between his eyes there, just above his forehead, on his forehead, just above his nose, a huge cut, a great gash in his face, which came as a result, and it went a livid red during meetings in the Second World War when he lost his temper, that came as a result of crossing the road in New York on Fifth Avenue and 76th Street, and being English, looking the wrong direction, and being hit by a car and very nearly killed. He spent 3 weeks in hospital.
So in the midst of all these, sort of political reverses, personal reverses, comes to nearly financial reverses, health reverses, somehow or another he perseveres during this decade, sort of a lonely voice warning a danger. Take us there and talk, to start with the fall from political grace, and who is he during this decade?
Well, he's very widely, you're right, I mean, financially he lost the equivalent of £500,000 in one day on the Wall Street crash. Modern equivalent. He, as you say, his health was always up and down. He had, as well as the car crash, he had 2 plane crashes, and another 3 car crashes in his life. He had nearly drowned swimming across Lake Geneva as a child. He'd escaped a house fire. Those were just peacetime brushes with death. So he had that. At the same time, he had the terrible sadness of the death of one of his children, his daughter Marigold, and yet, in that decade, when he was lambasted by the British establishment, the Conservative Party tried to take his seat away. He was shouted down in the House of Commons on one occasion and constantly ridiculed. But he never changed. He had, as well as this physical courage that I mentioned earlier, he had the moral courage not to alter his message, which was, all the way through the 1930s, that Hitler and the Nazis needed to be guarded against, and we needed rearmament, especially in the air, in order to protect ourselves from Hitler and the Nazis. And so that was part and parcel of why it was Churchill who came to power in 1940 rather than anyone else, because he had been the person who, for an entire decade, had been warning about precisely what actually came to pass.
So why is he unique? Why is he the guy who's blowing the danger
It's a very good question. I think it's three things overall. I think, firstly, he was a Philo-Semite. He liked Jews. He'd grown up with Jews. His father had liked Jews. He was a Zionist who supported the Balfour Declaration. And so he had an early warning system when it came to Hitler and the Nazis that was not vouchsafed to many of the other people on the conservative benches in of his age and class and background, many of whom were anti-Semitic. The second thing is that he was an historian, and he was able to place the threat that Hitler posed in the long continuum of British history, and saw it in terms of the threat posed by Philip II of Spain at the time of the Spanish Armada, and of Louis XIV of France, whose attempts to hegemonize the continent were stymied by Churchill's own great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough. And then Napoleon, of course, who Churchill admired personally for his ambition and his sense of destiny, but also he appreciated that Napoleon was attempting to take over the continent, and then the Kaiser, and then finally, of course, Hitler. And also, Churchill spotted in Hitler and the Nazis the same kind of political version of the fanaticism that he'd seen as a young man on the northwest frontier and in the Sudan in terms of Islamic fundamentalist religious fanaticism. And this, again, was something that just wasn't spotted at all by the prime ministers of the 1930s, because men like Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain had never actually come across any kind of fanaticism in their lives.
So, spring 1940, the United Kingdom and the West are reeling in the face of Nazi military power, their voices whispering that England might have to sue for peace and ask Herr Hitler for terms. And yet over a few days in May, this familiar figure, this voice in the wilderness, takes command of number 10 Downing. What happened?
Well, Neville Chamberlain was ousted effectively after the defeat in Norway, which was actually much more Winston Churchill's fault than Neville Chamberlain's, because he was First Lord of the Admiralty and it was very largely a naval defeat. Nonetheless, the British House of Commons voted in enough numbers, although Chamberlain won the vote. He won it by such a smaller amount than than his government usually won by, that there was a sense that he had morally lost the argument, and he resigned. And there was a choice between him and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, and at a key meeting on the 9th of May, it was decided by the four people in the room, Chamberlain, Churchill, Halifax, and the Chief Whip, David Margeson, that it should be Churchill whose name would be put forward to the King. There are so many different versions about what happened during that meeting, and I devote pretty much the whole of chapter 19 of this book to looking at the versions and to working out which ones I judge to be most likely. And I very much come down with the point of view that Winston Churchill did exactly what he'd always done all the way through his career, which was insist on getting the job. He claims that he sat back and just allowed it to be given to him, but that goes wholly against, first of all, what everybody else thought about that meeting and remembered of it, and secondly, what Churchill had done all the way through his career up until then.
You mentioned the king. For 75 plus years, historians have been, drooling over the prospect of getting into the king's private diaries. And you got into them.
Yeah.
And
can you imagine how annoyed other historians are?
Yeah. I understand contracts have been let on you, in fact. So as you read these, first of all, describe how you had to go read them. But as you read them, what did you learn about Churchill and about George VI and their relationship and the broader picture that you didn't know about before?
Yes, well, they're of course kept in the Round Tower at the Royal Archives, are in the top of that very old round tower, medieval thing in the middle of Windsor Castle that you'll recognise from Meghan's wedding, and you go up to the top there, and then they are very, very closely protected to the point that if you need to go to the restroom, you have an attendant in white gloves who follows you to make sure that you don't pop into any.
That's
other
a little
rooms
creepy.
To make sure you don't pop in and sort of pinch any of the documents that are around there. It's a wonderful archive, and I got a great kick from it, as you can imagine, being the first Churchill biographer allowed in, and into these particular papers. But what they told me really, they told me an awful lot of things. There's extensive quotation from them in this book. But the thing that most surprised me was the extent of the frustration, really, that Winston Churchill felt about the United States not getting more involved in the Second World War earlier. He saw the war in very much black and white terms as a war for civilization and democracy against the most evil man in history, and he couldn't understand why the Roosevelt administration was being so glacial in moving towards a bellicose stance. And of course, this was not something he could say in public. He couldn't say this in Parliament. He certainly couldn't say it on the airwaves to the United States. And so he used the king as a sounding board, really, and as a way of venting his frustration over this.
In the days that follow his ascension to power, number 10, he gives a remarkable set of speeches over the next months and years. Edward R. Murrow once said that Churchill, he mobilized the English language and sent it into war. What were the sources of this great strength of Churchill's, and from where did it come, and how much attention did he pay to what he said and how he said it?
Well, of course, he had he was self-educated, very largely self-educated, and he read an enormous amount. He could quote Shakespeare, huge reams of Shakespeare. He loved Macaulay and Gibbon and the great historians of the past. And it was because of that, and also the most extraordinary amount of practice. He gave the collection of his speeches, of all of his speeches, and I found actually 4 or 5 speeches that are not in the collected works. They cover 8,000 pages. And he gave many hundreds of public speeches before the war, and so he was very good at working out which phrases worked, and of course, as a result, given us phrases that will live for as long as the English tongue lives. And he was asked by his private secretary how it was that he was able to, what the tricks of the trade were, really, what his techniques were for writing these speeches that gave such extraordinary morale boost during the Second World War. And he said, well, look, there are 4 things in particular that I always keep in mind. The first is keep your sentences short. Second, always use short words. If there's a chance between a short word and a long word, go for the short word. The third one was each sentence needs to be perfectly clear. Everyone must understand exactly what you're saying in each sentence, so no waffle. And fourthly, use Anglo-Saxon words, use Old English words, use words that the English-speaking peoples will understand because they've used them in their everyday life for 1,000 years. And when you look at the peroration, the final paragraph of his great "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech of June 1940, in which he speaks of fighting in the streets and fighting in the hills, and how we shall fight with growing confidence in the air, and of course ending, "We shall never surrender." When you look at that 141 words of that paragraph, all but 2 of them are come from Old English, of those words. The 2 exceptions being confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French.
You are an Englishman, right? I'm just checking. So apropos of that, Churchill, of course, is the leader of one of the 3, de Gaulle would say 4, great powers, Allied powers. Talk for a moment about his relationship with FDR and then about Stalin.
Winston Churchill's relationship with FDR was always a good one personally. They got on well. They came from the aristocratic wings of their societies. They were both actually, Churchill's Tory democracy was almost analogous to the New Deal politics of FDR. They liked each other personally. They enjoyed each other's company and jokes. Churchill couldn't stand Roosevelt's cocktails. But other than that, there was nothing else that they sort of disagreed on until the fall of 1944, when, although they kept their personal friendship alive, nonetheless the post-war interests of the British Empire were diverging very strongly from those of the American Republic, and so at that point you actually get some 240 more messages going from Churchill to FDR than FDR replies to. There is a beginning of a breakdown in that relationship. With regard to Stalin, Churchill, of course, had been the great staunch anti-communist. He had virtually invented anti-communism. He had denounced Stalin and what he called his daily budget of executions in the 1930s at the time of the Great Purge, and was fully cognizant also by 1940 of the responsibility, Stalin's personal responsibility for the Katyn massacre of some 14,000 Polish officers. And yet, personally, he was able to get on with Stalin because it was so important that any British Prime Minister had to get on with the leader of Russia when the Russians were killing 4/5 of all Germans killed in combat, by which I don't mean bombed from the air, I mean soldiers killed on the ground. 4/5 of them were killed by the Russians. So it was essential that they got on, and they did get on. Churchill would go to Stalin's private apartment in the Kremlin and drink vodka with him till 3 o'clock in the morning, and would go to his dacha in the countryside, and that was the way that he established a personal relationship with Stalin, which in a way is quite troubling that he actually said in the Potsdam Conference in July 1945 to Anthony Eden, "I like that man," of Stalin. But of course, to set against that, he was, of course, also the person who not only just showed foresight before the Second World War, but after it too, when at the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946, he was also the first person to warn against Stalin and Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe.
You mentioned Roosevelt's cocktails. That brings up the subject of Mr. Churchill's drinking. He seems to have consumed large quantities, but doesn't seem, at least in the pages of your book, to be much affected by it.
No, Churchill drank an enormous amount, but he had the most iron constitution for it. It was, as he said, his servant rather than his master. He would a normal lunch during the Second World War would start off with a glass or two of champagne, and then he'd have a glass or two of white wine with his first course, and a glass or two of red wine with his main course, and then a glass or two of brandy. And then he'd go and have a nap for an hour or so. and then he'd have much the same to drink in the evening, and have a very weak whiskey and soda that his private secretaries, one of his private secretaries told me that it was more like mouthwash than an alcoholic drink. But that was kept up pretty much all the way through till he went to bed at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. One of Churchill's great friends, C.P. Snow, said of him that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much.
Victory in Europe. Hitler is dead, Nazism smashed, and yet within weeks Churchill has gone from number 10, ousted by the people of Britain. What happened?
Well, it was shocking to him. He went on these great election speeches, and people flocked to hear him, whether they were going to vote for him or not. As it turned out, they weren't. But nonetheless, he was such a personality that they all turned up to listen. And he took the wrong impression from this. He therefore thought that he was going to win the election. But he was only one name on 650 ballot papers. And the British people were exhausted by the war. They wanted the various things that the Labour Party were offering. And had it been a presidential system like you have, he'd have won. But as it was in the parliamentary system, people wanted to punish the Conservatives who had been responsible for appeasement. And so there was a landslide victory against him. And when it became clear that afternoon that this was happening, as the results were coming in, his wife Clementine said to him, well, darling, it might well be a blessing in disguise. And Churchill said, from where I'm sitting, it seems quite effectively disguised.
So Churchill is, I mean, he's a great man, and he gets the big things right. But he also, one of the things I take away from your book is that he is also clearly not infallible. He makes mistakes.
Yeah.
And he was a great man who made mistakes. And as a leader, how did he deal with the fact that he made mistakes?
Well, yes, you're quite right. I mean, he's a flawed, deeply flawed politician. I mean, he was making decisions, of course. He was in public life for 2/3 of a century. So he wasn't going to get everything right. But there is a long list of the things that he got wrong. He got women's suffrage wrong, the gold standard, the abdication crisis. We talked earlier about the Dardanelles campaign. Plenty more examples where that came from. And he said when he was fighting in the trenches, he wrote to his wife, Clementine, and he said, I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes. Because he was a politician who was capable of learning from his mistakes. He was somebody who, for example, with the Dardanelles, never once overruled the chiefs of staff in the Second World War. He would sit in these hard-fought meetings with the chiefs of staff. He had every constitutional right to if he wanted to. He was defense minister as well as prime minister. But he never once overruled them when all three of them agreed on something. So, yes, he did make mistakes. Not in the really big things. The really big things about the rise of Prussian militarism, the threat of Adolf Hitler, the threat of Joseph Stalin after the war. These are the really important decisions of the 20th century, and he got those right. But boy, there were an awful lot of lesser decisions that he got wrong.
So I'm going to reserve interviewer's prerogative, the final question to me. So we're going to turn to the audience here in just a moment, but I want to have a lightning round here. So,
Okay.
Favorite Churchill joke?
Well, they change all the time, my favourite Churchill joke, but the one I'm enjoying at the moment is his remark to Joachim von Ribbentrop, who later became German Foreign Secretary, but at the time he was the German ambassador to London, and when he threatened Churchill and said, in the next war, Italy will be on the side of the Third Reich. Churchill said, seems only fair. We had to have them last time.
So, favorite Churchill comeback in a parliamentary debate?
Favorite comeback? Oh, when one of the MPs shouted "rot" at him during his speech, and Churchill immediately replied, "I'd like to thank the honourable member for saying what's in his mind."
Okay, so I know this from my wife's personal experience. You have an extensive and highly prized collection of Churchill memorabilia. Favorite memento from your collection?
Ooh,
It's like picking out your favorite child.
his bow tie. I bought his bow tie at auction earlier last year, and was absolutely thrilled to discover much later on that the underbidder had been Gary Oldman.
So you won't be appearing in his next movie. Okay, so weirdest memento in your collection, weirdest.
I've got David Lloyd George's dress shirt, which my wife has always asked me to have washed, but it's got his DNA on it, so I'm not going to.
All right, let's turn to the crowd, and if you got a question, raise your hand. We'll let Andrew call on you and shout it out, and he'll repeat the question. We got one right here.
You mentioned you disagree with the point of divergence between Churchill and Roosevelt in 1944. What were those points of divergence?
Oh, they were mainly over post-war issues. Once the troops were landed in Normandy, Eisenhower very much had the say over whether or not to adopt the narrow thrust strategy into Germany or the broad front. He went for the latter, of course, and the British ultimately backed him over that. So as far as strategy was concerned, not a lot. But in the issues, say, of whether or not the monarchy was going to be allowed to continue in Greece and indeed Italy, over things like Argentinian meat, for some reason, was a huge bone of contention. The Americans were very unhappy with the way in which Churchill had imprisoned Mahatma Gandhi for his Quit India movement. There were arguments over, huge arguments over post-war trading relations, especially between Britain and the former British colonies, American and the former British colonies. I think there's a whole list of them in chapter, I think, 31, and I go into a few of them.
Another question, over here.
You've written biographies of both Churchill and Napoleon, probably the two greatest Europeans of the last 300 years. What similarities have you identified about them in their personalities, their backgrounds, or practices, whatever, that allowed them to have these great accomplishments?
That's a very good question, yes. Obviously driving ambition is true of both of them. I don't think ambition is a bad thing so long as it's allied to great talent, which in both of their cases, of course, it was. They both had this sense of destiny, that they both felt that they were walking with destiny. They came from, they were both aristocrats, Corsican aristocrat in Napoleon's case, of course, but Churchill was the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough, and both soldiers. And Churchill very much admired Napoleon. In fact, he wanted to write Napoleon's biography. And in a rather weird way, he also tried to persuade Charlie Chaplin to make a comedy movie about Napoleon. Now, I'm not sure how that would have turned out, but I think the biography would have been one of the great biographies of the world.
Yeah, minor similarity. Napoleon has a nympho sister, and Churchill has a, let's say, outgoing daughter-in-law.
Pamela Harriman, as I said earlier, I was given exclusive access to Pamela Harriman's papers. She was receiving, as well as being married to Randolph Churchill, her husband, by whom she had a baby. She also had an affair with Avril Harriman, who she subsequently married, FDR's envoy, and also Jock Whitney and Ed Murrow, and General Kenneth Anderson. and Marshal of the Air Force Sir Charles Portal, and someone we just know of as Jerry.
And these are all from her love letters.
These are all people who are sending her love letters, with whom she had an affair during the Second World War. And I like to say that although I had exclusive access to her love letters, nobody had exclusive access to her.
Did I see a question here? Yes.
Do you have a favorite portrayal of Churchill?
Portrayal, TV portrayal, or movie portrayal. Well, I thought that Gary Oldman was wonderful in Darkest Hour. With the prosthetics and the chuckle and the glint in his eye, I thought he captured Churchill absolutely brilliantly. Robert Hardy, I think, is still my favourite from the Wilderness Years TV series of the 1970s, but nonetheless, Gary Oldman was great. There have been some less good ones. I think John Lithgow, the 6'5" John Lithgow, in the Crown, playing the 5'6" Churchill, sometimes leaves something to be desired.
A little too much of Churchill in that one. Yeah, a little. Did I see something up here? A question up here? Yeah, here at the back. Center. Yes, sir. You, blue.
Yes, Mr. Churchill was a magnificent writer. Why did he write so much, and how did he write so much?
Poverty is the reason. He spent an enormous amount. He always wanted and needed to have the best of everything. He liked having silk next to his body all the time, and he smoked 160,000 cigars in his life, and in order to pay for this, he didn't get very much money from his spendthrift parents. So he wrote 37 books and 890 articles. And what happened was, if an editor turned down an article of his in the 1930s, he would just keep it and wait to use it again, which is something that a lot of journalists do, don't they, Karl?
I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate me.
And so you get the situation in March 1942, which is a terrible moment in the war, where the Japanese have taken about an eighth of the world's surface. The British are on the retreat in the North African littoral. The Russians are fully on the retreat in Ukraine. And this is the moment that Winston Churchill has managed to sell an old article that he's written years before to because he's Prime Minister and any editor will pay anything, and pays a fortune. He used to get £23,000 per article. It's about $30,000 per article. And so he chooses this terrible moment in the Second World War to publish an article in the Illustrated Sunday Herald entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" Which concludes that yes, there are such things as aliens and UFOs. I mean, an extraordinary thing. If Theresa May were to publish an article like that, one would wonder.
Over here.
I must ask, if we could produce Winston Churchill very much alive and vibrant and sitting next to you, what one question would you ask him if you were permitted? Only one.
I would ask him about this sense of destiny that he had. I'd like him to unpack that phrase about walking with destiny, because I do think it's a driving feature in his life. And he did talk about the invisible wings. He wasn't a Christian. He, in the whole of his 5.2 million words that he wrote and 6.1 million words that he spoke, he never said the word Jesus Christ. Or wrote it. He believed that there was an Almighty, but if you look carefully at it, theologically, the sole duty of the Almighty seems to have been to take care of Winston Churchill. So I think I try and unpack his views on this aspect of him.
Up here on the side.
Would you talk about his work as a bricklayer?
Yes, absolutely. This was another thing, along with painting, that allowed him to to really get away from politics and to concentrate on something else. He actually got accepted into the National Union of Bricklayers, he built not only two rather fine walls at Chartwell, his country house, but actually an entire cottage that he used later as a studio. And if you visit Chartwell, which I do recommend everybody do when they go to England, because it's a really wonderful place, splendid museum, and really captures the spirit of him, you can see these walls.
We've got another one here, but before, just a quick playing off the bricklayer. So President Bush took up painting, in part by reading an essay, because he read an essay by Churchill about the joy of painting that it, for 40-some-odd years, had given him. And shortly thereafter, I got married, and the president called up and said, I've got a gift for you. And I said, well, no gifts. He said, I'm going to paint your dogs. So for about 10 days, I got these stupid emails from him. Send me a picture of your dogs from the right side. Send me pictures of your dog from the left side. You say Bob is a chocolate lab. This isn't chocolate. Send me a picture of Bob's true color. I need Nan's face. You know, I need Nan lying down. After 10 days, he says, God, no more pictures. I got everything I need. I'm making really good progress. I think you're going to be very happy with what I did. And I emailed him back and said, thank God you didn't follow Churchill and take up bricklaying as well. Anyway, up here.
You mentioned Gandhi. Could you speak a little bit more about his views on race, both with regard to India and South Africa?
Yes, this is a as you can imagine, controversial and hard-fought issue. Winston Churchill said some extremely racist things in his life, very racist remarks, made racist jokes, and so on. And you have to remember, of course, that he was born in the same time that Charles Darwin was alive. And that however obscene and ludicrous it might seem to us, people did believe that there was a hierarchy of races. And they thought that that was scientific fact. And so when he went out to India, he very much believed in the British Empire. He believed that the British were doing good for the native peoples. And he dedicated his life, I mentioned earlier how he wasn't really a Christian. In a way, his secular belief was that of the British Empire. But it was a totally different kind of belief from the exterminationist racism of Adolf Hitler. It was what he took from this sense of a hierarchy of races was that the British owed a profound responsibility to the native peoples of the empire. And so when he looked at the British Empire as a young man, when he went out as a subaltern in the late 1890s, he saw a place that had doubled the life expectancy of Indians and had put 8 times more land under cultivation than before we went out, and that had created huge civil engineering projects and the largest railway system outside the United States, universities for the first time in India's history, and created peace for the longest time in India's history. And he thought that that was something, and of course had abolished sati, the horrific throwing of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres, and various other practices like that, sati as well. And thought it was worth defending and worth fighting for. And so when in November 1942 he said that he did not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, he meant it. And neither in that premiership nor in his post-war premiership from 1951 to 55 were any colonies made independent.
Oh, let's do one more up here, and then I'm going to close with a final question. Right there.
It's my understanding that the king wanted Halifax to be the prime minister, and I was wondering if in fact that's true, and if so, how long did it take the king to change his mind, or did he?
Yes, no, that's true. He did. He he knew Halifax well. He was told by Neville Chamberlain that Halifax couldn't take the job because he was in the House of Lords, and by that stage you really did need to have a Prime Minister in the House of Commons. But the King said, well, can't we put his peerage into abeyance? And the great thing about the unwritten British Constitution is you can do anything if you want. You know, that could be a one-line Act of Parliament that could be passed in an afternoon. But Churchill, in the meeting of the 9th of May, Churchill had really secured the succession, and it wasn't down to the King; it was down to those 4 men in the room. So the King's objections were overruled effectively, and Neville Chamberlain said, no, it will be Winston Churchill that we call upon.
So, final question. 54 some odd years after he's died, why has this man got such a hold on us that several hundred people show up to hear a talk by a Brit about Winston Churchill? What is going on here with this? Because we do have this fascination with him. Your book's been on the bestseller list for 8 weeks, and movies are made about him and win prizes, and yet he's been gone for so long.
Yes, I think it's a number of things. I think we love the idea of a leader who doesn't, with all due respect to you, Karl, have any spin doctors.
All you really need is one good one.
Doesn't have any spin doctors, who dictated all his own speeches, so when he spoke, you knew it was him who was speaking. He never employed a speechwriter. He never took any notice of opinion polls or focus groups. So he was leading and saying what he believed, and I think that that's something that's very attractive. I think a leader who was able to look, to see into the future, to have the most extraordinary foresight, to be able to warn against Prussian militarism, then the Nazis, and then Soviet imperialism, is also something that impresses people. Somebody who has such tremendous moral courage to not be blown off course, allied to great physical courage, and somebody who has such eloquence that they're able to coin phrases which will, as I say, live for as long as our language does. I think those things will always fascinate us, and it'll be a sad day for us, really, as people, if we're no longer interested in people like Winston Churchill. I'd like to just finish, though, with a joke, one of Winston Churchill's jokes, which I particularly love, which is that when his private secretary came to him and told him that their cook had been made pregnant as the result of a nocturnal assignation with a man in the street in Verona, Winston Churchill immediately replied, "Obviously not one of the two gentlemen." Thank you very much indeed.